In November 1908, a prestigious banquet took place at a painter's studio in Paris, hosted by Pablo Picasso. As the evening wore on, Picasso's guests enjoyed music, singing, dancing and drinking, as the guest of honor reveled in the center stage. This was a 64-year-old man whose art had now gained him the recognition that he'd longed for all his life. His name was Henri Rousseau. Rousseau remains one of the unlikeliest characters ever to attain artistic greatness. His personality was naive and innocent, reflecting his own humble background. His trusting nature was often exploited by the practical jokers among his friends. He told hopeless lies about an adventurous youth that never existed. Despite many difficulties with the technical aspects of painting, the self-taught artist succeeded in creating a vision that was entirely his own in pictures full of freshness and vitality. It was an amazing achievement. Rousseau was well into middle age before he even began to paint. He was an old man by the time his work was appreciated by the likes of Picasso. By then, he could bask in the glory of fame at last.
Henri Rousseau's work was a complete break with academic painting, and it was this that inspired other artists like Picasso to admire him so much. Because he did it, he broke with academic painting quite unconsciously. He painted as he wished to and wanted to be recognized as an academic painter. But his naivety, his style was so outlandish. It provided delight for all those people who didn't like academic work at the period, at the time. His painting was an imaginative exercise.
Avant-garde artists were open, were looking for an escape or a way of escape or a clue as to how to free themselves from the straitjacket of late Renaissance, the academic work. And here was a man, an artist who was not from Africa, who was not from America. He was quite clearly an urban Western man, and yet he didn't see in the way that, productions showed that he didn't see in the way that a Western civilized Renaissance man should be painting. So I think in that sense he was alongside all the other influences which were coming to bear, and he was unique.
Henri Rousseau was born on the 21st of May, 1844, in the modest French town of Laval. He was the son of an ironmonger, and his family had no interest in the arts. Later in his life, Rousseau recalled his parents' lack of culture with some bitterness. But it's likely that they had little time for artistic matters. Life was hard in Laval. When Rousseau was 9 years old, the family finances collapsed, and his parents left the town, leaving their son behind at the local boarding school. Although he showed some promise in music and drawing, when he left school in 1860, it was to take a humdrum office job. Three years on, the future artist was still engaged in routine work, and there is no evidence of any youthful paintings or drawings. But perhaps the creative spirit was already with him. In 1863, Rousseau was caught stealing from his employers. Although it was a small theft, his misdemeanor earned him a month in prison. Shortly afterwards, he decided to join the French army, a good move for a young man in search of adventure. But it is at this stage of Rousseau's life that fact and fiction become blurred.
Rousseau was an ambitious man. He wanted to be known as a painter. He capitalized on the fact that people laughed at his work and made fun of him, and perpetuated rumors like the one he'd been fighting abroad, for example, which he hadn't been doing. And he suppressed other stories, like the fact that he'd stolen money or been accused of embezzlement. He liked to romanticize his life as he romanticized his art.
In his later years, Rousseau loved to describe his adventures as a soldier. Many of these concerned a tour of duty in Mexico. In the mid-1860s, the French Emperor Napoleon attempted to install an ally as the Mexican emperor, and Rousseau claimed he had taken part in the fighting that resulted. He also alleged that his famous paintings of jungle scenes were inspired by what he had seen abroad. But it was all fiction. Rousseau never went anywhere near Mexico. Equally untrue was his claim to have fought heroically during the 1870 Franco-Prussian War. Throughout his life, Rousseau was happy to exaggerate his own achievements.
The fundamental difference between what he perceived and what actually took place, or what actually occurred, reflects a man who really was living in an unreal world. And when we talk about truths or half-truths or lies, I don't think in terms of Henri Rousseau we can apply the same criteria that we would to other people, because his unreal, his half-truth world was to him real. Therefore, to talk about it as if it was real wasn't to him a half-truth or a lie.
For all Rousseau's claims about his adventurous life, we know that by 1871 he was settled into the dull civilian job that would take up most of his life. After leaving the army, he moved to Paris to work for the French customs office at one of the city gates. He was now married, and his wife, Clémence, gave birth to 7 children. Sadly, 5 of them died in infancy. Rousseau carried on with his mundane working life. When he eventually became known as an artist, he took the nickname Le Douanier, or customs officer, though his position was never senior enough to qualify him for the title. With hindsight, there was much to exaggerate. All through his 30s, the future artist carried on working for the Parisian customs, and there is little evidence for any creative work. But in the early 1880s, Henri Rousseau made the surprising decision to become a painter. His motivations are unclear, but once he had made his decision, he stuck to it. In 1884, he secured permission to study the great works of the Louvre. Though he still worked in his humble day job, he was now convinced of his destiny as a great artist.
He wasn't really a customs officer. He was employed by the customs, what we would call the customs service, in a very lowly capacity, really almost as a sort of a doorkeeper. From what one gathers, he was not regarded as being very capable or able, but rather likable. And he was kept on with very light tasks for quite some time. He got involved and swayed and influenced by certain intellectuals, a writer called Jarret, for instance, who introduced him to a number of other people, other artists and intellectuals. And his make-believe world, which was to him real, convinced him that he really was a genius and a great artist, and that is what he should be doing.
We cannot be sure when Rousseau first took up painting seriously, but by 1885 he had rented a studio in Paris's Impasse du Maine, and he set about his true vocation. The following year, he painted this canvas, known as the Carnival Evening, a work that is now admired for its moody, otherworldly atmosphere, but whose technical failings are also evident. The flat central figures appear to have been cut out of a book and pasted onto the canvas. When the work was first exhibited, it was greeted with a mixture of scorn and hilarity. Though it was an age when many new artistic visions were coming to the fore, Rousseau's efforts were seen as little more than the work of a child. But at least it was exhibited. In earlier years, a canvas like this could not have secured a public showing. Traditionally, the official Paris Salon had been the only place where artists could exhibit their work. But times were changing. The Impressionists had reacted against the academic formalism of the Salon with their own series of exhibitions starting in 1874. 10 years later, another unofficial showcase was established, the so-called Salon des Indépendants. Here, artists could exhibit anything they liked. There was no academic jury to reject their work. For the painter of this almost amateur image, the Salon des Indépendants was little short of a gift from God.
In 1886, Rousseau exhibited at the Salon des Indépendants, and the painting he exhibited was a carnival evening, and it created an enormous scandal, a scandal of success, if you like. And he relished this. He relished the notoriety. And he exhibited at the Salon des Indépendants continually thereafter, except in '89 and on another occasion. So it served a very useful focus for him, of course, reasons he could paint, exhibit, and it kept him in the public eye, and it brought him to the attention of serious artists who actually enjoyed his work eventually, like Picasso, Gauguin, and other friends.
Henri Rousseau's introduction to other intellectuals and artists was further emphasized by the Salon des Indépendants, because here he was being exhibited, or at least introduced to, the avant-garde. And this is what he felt he was. He was part of the avant-garde, major rank. And to be amongst that group, therefore, it seemed to underline to him his status within the intellectual artistic community.
Throughout Rousseau's artistic career, he remained loyal to the Salon des Indépendants. The exhibition itself became the subject for one of his later paintings. Sadly, many of Rousseau's exhibited works are now lost, and the identity of those that survive is often obscure. This forest scene may have been shown at the 1886 Indépendant event, but we can't be sure. The response to Rousseau's art, however, was damning. They were ridiculed. It almost became a ritual at the Salon des Indépendants. Though Rousseau's work was never located in the prime positions, both critics and public made a point of visiting the naive paintings of the obscure part-time artist. Well into his 40s, Rousseau still had to put in 70 hours a week at his day job, but he somehow found the time to carry on painting, still convinced of his own abilities and prepared to ignore the mocking of the critics. By 1890, Henri Rousseau felt able to proclaim his own status as an artist through his first masterpiece, an image inspired by one of the major events of the artist's life, the great Parisian World's Fair of 1889.
Henri Rousseau, not unlike other artists at the time, were open to influence from all sorts of, if you like, foreign or non-Western influences. At the foot of the Eiffel Tower is a series of glass exhibition areas in which there were exciting and exotic, intriguing exhibitions of artifacts and events from Mexico, from other parts of South America, from different parts of the world. And it was just a marvelous sort of dream world for him.
This was a huge exhibition to mark the centenary of the French Revolution. For 6 months, visitors marveled at the artistic and scientific exhibits contained within the many glass pavilions of the World's Fair. Highlights included a reconstructed Mexican palace and many other recreations of life in exotic lands. Rousseau loved it. What he saw at the World's Fair would stay with him for the rest of his life.
Rousseau loved modern technology, the carnival atmosphere of uniforms and flags, and he actually incorporated certain aspects of it into his paintings. He did a painting of myself, portrait landscape, and in it he incorporated a hot air balloon from the World Fair and flags of different nations, and he did this painting about a year after he'd been at the World Fair.
The World's Fair that inspired Rousseau so much finally closed in October 1889. but we can still see its legacy in the shape of the most famous of all Parisian landmarks, the Eiffel Tower, constructed for the event. We can also see this great feat of engineering in the first important work of Henri Rousseau's career, 1890's Myself Portrait Landscape. This was an amateur painter's bold attempt to present himself as a fine artist. Rousseau believed that his combination of portrait and landscape was entirely original, and he liked to consider himself the creator of a new artistic genre. But contemporary critics were unimpressed. More than ever before, the canvas was greeted with mockery. It is not difficult to see the picture's technical weaknesses. The artist's feet are especially unimpressive. Rousseau would never master the complex spatial planes required to paint feet effectively. His response would be typically naive. In his later works, he simply buried his feet in undergrowth. But despite the flaws of this earlier canvas, it succeeds as a whole in making a powerful impact upon the viewer.
His painting, Myself Portrait Landscape, was much admired by Berlin Dada, by Apollinaire's Circle, and by Robert Delaunay as expressing the genius of the people, in other words, a proletariat painting, nothing to do with academia. They liked its naivety, its renunciation of perspective, and its belief in the artist as a noble being.
It's a statement of him. He's larger than anything else. He's got all the attributes of artist there. He's making a statement. He claimed, the critic talked about it being a sort of a landscape and portrait landscapes. And this appealed to him, and he really felt that he'd actually invented it. And so he claimed that he invented the portrait landscape.
The portrait landscape that we see today is not the same as the work exhibited in 1890. The artist later reworked the palette to include two female names, Clémence, his wife, who died of tuberculosis in 1888, and Josephine, the woman who became the second Madame Rousseau in 1899. By that time, Rousseau's art had taken over his life. He saw little of his surviving children, and in 1893, he was at last able to retire from the customs gate that may have been the subject for this earlier canvas. When Rousseau eventually left his day job, he was 49 years old, and his pension was not enough to provide a comfortable living. In the years after his retirement, he suffered much in the way of financial hardship, but he was able to devote himself to his increasingly bold painting. Even before his retirement, Rousseau's pictures were growing larger in scale and greater in ambition. In 1891, he painted this large canvas depicting a tiger taken by surprise in a colourful jungle setting. This was the first of many similar scenes of exotic plant and animal life, which may be the best-known images of the artist's career.
In his jungle paintings, Rousseau was influenced by the Orientalists, also possibly by the fact that he was rumoured to have been abroad in Africa. What he enjoyed, I think, about the jungle paintings was the way he could let his imagination run riot. He actually studied the plants and trees that he showed. He showed different leaves. The leaf was the sort of module in these paintings, different kinds of leaves, different plants. Not in proportion, of course, used as a decorative element. But he was able to build up a real sense of the overwhelmingness of the jungle. And the way the animals were partially hidden by the trees, or sometimes people were partially hidden, helps the sense that we are in a very thickly wooded area, and mysterious as well. And he used about 50 different kinds of green.
Rousseau referred to them as his Mexican paintings, claiming that they were inspired by his foreign travels as a young man. In fact, these jungles were inspired by nothing more distant than the hothouses of Paris's Jardin des Plantes. Rousseau did not have to travel far to find vegetation to inspire his jungle paintings. For animals, he didn't need to leave his studio. After Rousseau's death, it was discovered that he owned a book of animal photographs entitled Bêtes sauvages, the savage beasts. It quickly became clear that for many of his animal figures, he had simply copied the photographs wholesale. This is a Rousseau painting from late in the artist's career. A willingness to borrow compositional elements from other sources was a feature of Rousseau's approach all through his career. And he was happy to use mechanical assistance. We can see this in his first jungle painting. And it can also be identified in this 1892 canvas, the Centenary of Independence. For the outline of the central figures in this ambitious painting, we know that Rousseau used a tracing device to take an existing image and transfer it, enlarged, to the canvas, a device known as the pantograph.
The pantograph was a simple device, but a very important device, which actually had a long history. There had been pantographs for some time, but which could enlarge a small drawing. One end of it you could trace on a photograph or a drawing, and then the other end it would enlarge it. For Henri Rousseau, he relied a lot and was excited by lots of illustrations, particularly photographs of wild beasts and things like that. And he would be able to use that. He used that to trace out this so he could enlarge it onto his canvas or paper. And then, so in practical terms, a pantograph, an enlarging instrument for enlarging, was extremely useful. He used it a lot.
Rousseau's use of the pantograph might be frowned upon, but it enabled the artist to concentrate on his strength as a colorist. Shortly after completing this striking image, he met an individual who appreciated the naive freshness of his art. Around 1893, Rousseau became acquainted with the writer Alfred Jarry. In the years that followed, Jarry encouraged and supported his friend more than anyone before. It was Jarry who commissioned the only print that Rousseau ever made, this lithograph depicting war. And this small image also inspired the boldest work of the artist's career. In 1894, this canvas, also entitled War, was revealed to a stunned audience at the Salon des Indépendants.
This painting was painted in 1894, a year after he'd left his job at the toll gate. It might reflect some of the problems he'd had leaving his job and becoming an artist. It was his attempt to enter the academic circle with a subject that was acceptable, traditional, the horsemen of the apocalypse, war, and so on. It's a big painting, 1 metre by 2 metres, more or less. And it shows this amazing black horse flying over recumbent, dead bodies, arms chopped off, and so on. And in the background, you have trees, outlines of trees, and an extraordinarily pink cloud against the blue sky. So it has conflict in the very composition. The sky, for example, is peaceful, but the horse is very moving and fast and horrific, and then you've got these dead white bodies at the bottom. So it's a very strong and strange painting.
War remains one of the most important works of Rousseau's career, and it generated real critical acclaim. A long article in the Mercure de France described the canvas as the most remarkable painting of the 1894 Indépendance show. The sheer originality of the work was praised, and Rousseau was delighted. He was now increasingly confident in his own abilities. Shortly after the Mercure de France article was printed, Rousseau heard that a Parisian publisher was planning a book about the best new artists of the age, the so-called painters of the next century. Without being asked, he wrote down a summary of his own career and sent it to the publisher for inclusion. Though the book was never produced, Rousseau's words have survived. He describes his hardships dating back to childhood. He also alludes to his self-teaching as an artist. He names just 3 influences on his work: nature itself and 2 obscure academic painters, Gérôme and Clément. To this day, students of Henri Rousseau are fascinated by the sources of his artistic inspiration. It may be that his work was so original that we cannot really talk of influences at all.
Rousseau was influenced by Jérôme and Clément, academic artists, possibly also by Géricault's Raft of the Medusa in the early part of the century. He was also influenced by the Orientalists, especially, of course, in his later jungle paintings.
We know that Rousseau admired Léon Bonnat, a portraitist and teacher whose paintings were characterized by an often dramatic use of black and white. Rousseau developed a similar enthusiasm. His blacks are especially striking, as we can see in much of the portrait work that he carried out in the later 1890s. Paul Gauguin is said to have admired the intensity of Rousseau's blacks in images like Boy on the Rocks, completed in 1897, and this earlier Portrait of a Woman. This may be Josephine, the artist's second wife, but we may never know for sure. It was the purchase of this painting that later inspired Picasso to organize the famous banquet in Rousseau's honor. Portraiture took up much of Rousseau's time in the later 1890s. Any commission was valuable given the artist's financial predicament. He also painted a large body of landscape scenes, such as this view of the Bièvre et Gentil. Images like this can be seen as technically stronger than Rousseau's portraits, but at the time they fetched little more than a few centimes for the struggling artist. Rousseau's landscapes are amongst his most satisfying works. These are sympathetic images of the suburban environment that the artist knew so well. They do have weaknesses. The spatial recession of the road in this 1902 canvas is lacking in conviction. But, as with all the artist's work, the freshness and originality of Rousseau's landscapes overcame his technical failings.
Rousseau's landscapes are quite charming in a naive kind of way. He has the texture of the trees very carefully delineated. The perspective is very personal, and sometimes the relation of the fences and the trees to the people also is personal. Sometimes the people are very small, sometimes they're very large. They're very refreshing, his landscapes.
If we look at the way that he tackles and uses landscape features and plants, they are each seen individually and uniquely and equally, so that the composition is based upon equal things which are of equally importantly seen, equally importantly defined within the whole. And he does look, I mean, he is looking, but he's looking in a different way perhaps than, say, Cézanne. But I do think that it is the business of looking that's important, and the fact that he is able to bring together what may seem very disparate things, and that he elaborates them.
Landscapes like these remain honest images of an environment familiar to the artist. But Rousseau himself did not place as high a value on his landscapes as he did with his more imaginative work. These were pictures that depicted no place on earth and the most famous of them all was painted in 1897, The Sleeping Gypsy. This large canvas can now be seen in New York's Museum of Modern Art, an appropriate location for a canvas whose sheer modernity remains integral to its appeal. Rousseau had once described himself as a realist painter, but the 21st century viewer can surely see more than surrealism in this haunting image. It remains the most mysterious and influential work of Rousseau's career.
Colour, the use of paint, and the dreamlike quality are all elements which are there orchestrated together. I find it interesting that the robe of the gypsy reminds me of later 20th century colour work, hard edge abstraction. Now that isn't consciously, obviously, only Rousseau's, but what emerges quite unconsciously is a relationship of colour and the use of colour, concern with colour, which really doesn't come until later on in the 20th century. So I find that fascinating. On the use of paint, this is not the paint of Van Gogh, that is of using it as a physical entity. It is using paint as colour, and therefore it is different than, well, Cézanne or Gauguin as well, for that matter. And it's a rather traditional, very traditional, in fact, way. It's the sort of way you apply paint as you saw in the Salon paintings, or in this country's Royal Academy paintings. But over that, it doesn't get in the way. It only serves to emphasize this dreamlike quality. Now, this is something which is indefinable as far as I'm concerned. That he, with all these, you can analyze all these bits and pieces, the way he does this, the way he paints this, the colour. But in the end, it's a reaction to the final work, which I find most eerie. This is a good example, that it transcends all of those things and becomes something which floats separately as a sort of supernatural being. So that's my reaction to it.
The Sleeping Gypsy is now recognized as a masterpiece, but initially it was neglected. 26 years after its completion, it was found lying in a plumber's workshop. It was not the only Rousseau canvas to suffer such a fate. In 1944, his amazing War was discovered in a farmer's barn. Many Rousseau works are still missing today. We know this because we know the names of the pictures he exhibited each year at the Salon des Indépendants. All through his life as an artist, Rousseau remained loyal to the event. Only in 1899 and 1900 did he not exhibit there. This is surprising because he was deep in debt by the turn of the century. But Rousseau remained convinced that he would be recognized as a great artist. Then all his problems would be solved. Rousseau had an incredible faith in himself. Without it, he would not have been able to cope with the continued mocking of many critics. But Rousseau's was an innocent, almost childlike belief that people soon realized could be exploited for fun. Throughout his life as an artist, he was the gullible victim of jokers who exploited his naivety.
I think Rousseau probably was gullible and naive, but not gullible and naive enough not to know that people thought he was like this and mocked him or made fun of him. I think we should feel sympathetic towards him, really. He wanted to become a famous person, and he capitalized on his natural gifts in order to do this.
Towards the end of his life, Rousseau's gullibility led to his involvement in an unfortunate criminal escapade. But his continuing problems with money may also have contributed. In the early years of the new 20th century, he was still in serious debt. He handed over paintings to pay off small bills, and he was forced to take work as a decorator and music teacher. The self-taught artist also opened his own teaching studio. This might seem bizarre, but by 1903, Rousseau could at least point to the occasional successful canvas. That year, he sold this enigmatic image of a child for the sum of 300 francs. to Fate Baby is a picture that reveals the artist's ongoing technical problems. We can see that Rousseau has by now given up any attempt at the difficult business of painting feet. But by the time he created this portrait of Edmund Frank in 1906, his human images were finding buyers. More than ever, Rousseau now believed in his status as an artist. This 1906 canvas confirms his confidence. Here we see Liberty inviting the artist to exhibit at the 22nd Salon des Indépendants, an image that celebrates the annual exhibition that Rousseau loved so much. He still exhibited at the Salon des Indépendants every year, but by the time he created this image of celebration, he had also become involved with a new avant-garde event, the Salon d'Automne. It was an important step in his career. In 1905, he exhibited this canvas depicting a lion attacking an antelope. His painting of lush vegetation had now reached mastery, and the work was well received by many critics. This Rousseau canvas was bought by a dealer for 200 francs. Though the artist was now in his 60s, he was making new friends among the Parisian avant-garde. The poet Guillaume Apollinaire became a champion of Rousseau's work and commissioned this portrait showing himself alongside his mistress. Another admirer was the abstract painter Robert Delaunay, who used his influence to secure the commission of The Snake Charmer, just one of the many jungle scenes to which the artist now devoted his efforts.
To be surrounded by what might be an ordinary grass, but with immense proportions, or a sort of rhubarb leaf, which was as high as a house appeared to be. Part and parcel of his dream world, the jungle became a symbol for that which was unknown, frightening, exciting, colourful, full of sounds and fury and silence and all these sorts of things. Each leaf, each form is seen as an entity.
By 1908, jungle scenes like this had helped to secure the artist's status among the Parisian avant-garde. Rousseau now took to inviting his new friends to social evenings at his home. Also invited were his neighbours, his students, and ordinary working folk, like the greengrocer, Père Junier, the subject of this 1908 canvas. But of all the new friends that Rousseau made in his early 60s, none were more significant than a Paris-based Spanish painter who stunned the world with his first great canvas and would go on to become the greatest artist of the 20th century, Pablo Picasso.
What Picasso and his fellow artists admired in Rousseau's work was the imaginative quality, the way the artist followed his own intuition and his own feelings so honestly and directly, and was able to produce these paintings that people laughed at, but nevertheless went on producing them. It was really true to his own vision.
In November 1908, Picasso visited a Parisian junk shop where he discovered this 1896 Rousseau canvas for sale. The asking price was just 5 francs. A delighted Picasso bought the picture immediately and decided to arrange a great banquet in celebration. It was the night when Henri Rousseau's faith in himself was finally rewarded.
In 1908, Picasso was living in a run-down boarding house called Bateau Lavoir, where he also had his studio. And it was in his room in this building that he gave a banquet for Rousseau. Many of Picasso's friends, including his mistress Fernande, were gathered round the table with Rousseau, and they were waiting for food which actually never arrived, so it was a fiasco to start off with. But Rousseau was very happy talking about his paintings and himself, and everybody else got drunk on the wine that had already arrived. and sardines they had to eat. I don't really know what to make of this myself. It's gone down in history, but nobody else either seems to know whether Picasso was being truly sincere in fating Rousseau or just having another party.
The feast took place at Picasso's own studio. There was music, there was singing, and there was dancing. There was also an element of farce when the host realized that he'd given his caterers the wrong day to deliver the party food. So a number of guests ventured out into the night to buy any sustenance they could as the merrymaking continued, with Rousseau at center stage. Late in the evening, his friend Apollinaire decided to compose a poem in his honor, and his words of praise have survived to this day. Glorious painter of our dear Republic, your name is the flag of the proud independence, and it is in white marble wrested from the Pentelic that your features will be sculpted, pride of our age. Rousseau left Picasso's banquet at dawn. He was tired, but he must have felt an intense sense of pride. All his faith had paid off. He was now a successful artist, but he was still a gullible man. And even as he parted with Picasso, he knew that a serious court case was looming against him. Having been duped by a so-called friend into opening a false bank account, Rousseau faced a jail sentence for fraud. But when the case came to court in January 1909, he escaped with a suspended sentence. In the end, it was the obvious naivete of his character that saved him, and his paintings were displayed in court as evidence of his childlike simplicity. Rousseau was free to carry on painting, and as he entered his final years, it was jungle scenes that provided the subject matter for his work. He was now aware of the talents he possessed, and it was his skill with color that pleased him most. When one friend came to Rousseau's studio, he found the artist at work on one of his jungle pictures. The visitor was informed that no less than 22 greens had already been used in the composition of the painting.
In Rousseau's depictions of nature, forest, landscapes, he's quite a skillful colorist, I would say. Not naturalistic, but he gets across the effect he wants. He's quite a brash colorist, not subtle, doesn't indulge in tonalities very much. I don't think his color is the most important part of his work. I think it's an element that adds to the dreamlike, hallucinatory quality of his paintings.
Colour he was excited by. In the end result, of course, was that if we take, say, the colour green and foliage and plants, he managed to get a wide variety, a considerable variety of colour, of variation of colour, of definition. So it was, in that sense, by accident, became very sophisticated, although it wasn't sophisticated. Contradiction in term.
In 1910, Rousseau knew that he was approaching the end of his life. Increasingly ill, he decided to pull together all the strands of his art in one enormous final canvas. The Dream, a remarkable jungle image created by a man who had never seen a jungle in his life. Here we can see the atmosphere and mood that characterizes Rousseau's greatest work. It may depict nowhere on earth, but as a triumph of the imagination, it remains one of the finest artistic achievements of the 20th century.
When asked about the dream, Rousseau said that the woman was asleep on a sofa and imagining that she was in the jungle, which explains why we have a sofa in the middle of the jungle. The shape of the woman's body is very sinuous and lovely, and then in the background, just behind her, we have a flute player, a snake charmer in fact, half hidden among the greenery. And in front of the snake charmer there's part of a snake wriggling away. And hidden among the trees, the foliage, there are animals. It's a charming painting. It is like a dream. It could be Adam and Eve. There's a simplicity about it which is very sweet.
This huge painting was the final great achievement of Henri Rousseau. In September 1910, he died in a Parisian hospital. He was 66 years old. Shortly afterwards, he was buried in a tomb with a poem of praise by his famous friend Apollinaire. This honor marked the end of an amazing journey by an incredible man. Well into his middle age, the self-taught Rousseau escaped from a life of dull routine to become a fated member of avant-garde society. Rousseau believed in himself and, virtually alone, he established himself as a great artist of his time. It was an achievement we can still admire today.
What I admire most about Rousseau is his adherence to his own vision. So he stuck to this and created a whole persona for himself and an area of art in which he was the one well-known person.
What I find most important about Henri Rousseau's work is its simplicity, its directness. I think that, in simple terms, is what he has contributed. Free from the sophistication and the controversy of the contemporary society, it frees the artist.